It's been a long time since I've done one of these diaries. In fact, it's been over 2.5 years. Now, got to the point I thought, you know what, I'm going to stop releasing the footage, I'm going to stockpile it, and then further down the line, I'll do something with it, and the time is now. Fish were ghosting into the edge, and I'm stood there in the trees, I'm looking into the margin, and there was one particular spot in the back of the snags. As there often is, there's always one bit in the back of the trees that's more polished than everywhere else, and on this spot, I could see fish creeping in. And then all of a sudden, I've watched him shake his head and he's off, and I've hooked another fish. It's one of those times where I just thought, I cannot go home, I have to do everything I can to stay. Fish was 35.5 pounds, might have even been 36, something like that. Big deep mirror, a few scales along his side. Well, how about that? An absolutely incredible carp. I had a score to settle with her, and I'm so pleased to say that I have. It's been a long time since I've done one of these diaries. In fact, it's been over 2.5 years. Now, in that time, I've still filmed pretty much everything that I've been up to. So, although I've not done anything with the footage, I've been stockpiling it. And the reason for that is, when you're fishing these kind of lakes, the lake I'm at today, the lake I'm going to talk about, this is a busy club water. And at the time, I just wanted to keep things close to my chest, because as soon as you start putting stuff out there all the time, when you fish these lakes, you're very much in competition with the other anglers. Whether you like it or not, you are. When you're fishing for a carp like this one, which doesn't get caught very often, it's a hard fish to catch, and this is the kind of carp that can take a very long time to catch. So the more you put out there for people to see, the more you give away, the more chance you have of ruining your fishing. And at times over the years, that's happened. So got to the point I thought, you know what, I'm going to stop releasing the footage, I'm going to stockpile it, and then further down the line, I'll do something with it, and the time is now. I haven't caught the common I'm fishing for, that's not why I'm doing this, but I'm at a stage now on here where I've caught a lot of the other carp, so I feel like actually the things I've done in the past, I'm happy to talk about them. And like I say, we're going to go back almost 2.5 years. So as I sit here today, mid-session, full moon was 2 days ago, prime time for this fish, and unfortunately, I haven't caught it, but it hasn't been out to anyone else. We're in October now, autumn is well and truly upon us, and although it's been very warm lately, we're starting to get that wind and that rain, and this is prime time to catch that carp, hence why I'm back here now. So before I get to this stage, we need to rewind the clocks and go back, as I just said, a very long way, over 2 years. The last time I did a diary about this place, it was in the spring of 2019, and in that last diary, I had a close encounter with the carp I wanted to catch. In fact, it was caught out the very swim that I'm sat in now, and I was fishing the adjacent swim next door. The fish came out at the biggest weight it had ever done. It looked incredible, and that was those sort of things, seeing those kind of fish on the bank, it really fires you up. Now, that year I had a baby due. My baby was due to be born in July, and after that capture in May, it very rarely gets caught in the summer, this fish. So I fished for a little bit longer, and then I stopped fishing for around about 6 weeks or so. And then all of a sudden I got to the point and I thought, hang on a minute, I'm about to have a baby. My first baby as well, so that's a pretty scary thing, especially when you're a carp angler who likes to go fishing a lot, which I was. And for some people, having a baby can completely change their life, and for some people, I'm sure it can completely ruin their fishing. I'm very lucky that that's not the case for me. My missus is great, she lets me go. And it got to the point, like I say, where she was heavily pregnant, and I thought, I need to be getting as much fishing as I can, because before I know it, I'm going to have a kid, and I don't know what's going to happen. I didn't know how that was going to affect my life. So I started to come down here, and my plan was to bait the lake. So walk around the lake, bait lots of likely looking areas, and try and make something happen that way. The good thing about doing that sort of thing is it's visual fishing, and you can keep an eye on the spots, you can see where the fish are, rather than just fishing out in the lake. It's all well and good doing that, and obviously I do that a lot of the time, but with the baby due, I thought, I'll tell you what I'll do something that can suit my fishing up to the birth of the baby, but also once the baby is born as well. And by doing short sessions, lots of baiting, the lake's only 15 minutes from my house, so I was able to pop down here, put a bit of bait in, walk around, check all my spots, and doing that regularly, you're able to train the carp to visit the areas, and that means that you can turn up, drop onto the spots, and you don't have to be there very long. You can be there for a few hours if the conditions are right, and if you've seen fish in the area, you can drop a rig in and you can catch the carp. Now, this lake at the time, probably had around 50 fish in, something like that. Maybe a few more, it's hard to say, you know, some people know a little bit more than me, but I've got a pretty good idea what's in here. And I'd say back then, you're looking at about 50 carp. So not loads of fish. The lake is, I don't know, 5 or 6 acres. And around the lake, you've got some snaggy areas. There used to be very snaggy, this place, but I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now, they cut a lot of the snags out, and there are still some left. So these were the areas that I decided to target, you know. Snaggy lakes, busy lakes in particular, the fish will use those areas, particularly in the summer months when it's nice and hot, you know, they can creep into the edges, they can sit amongst the branches of the trees, and they feel safe there. So my plan was to come down regularly, bait the spots regularly, and then drop in to the areas that I felt suited the conditions at the time. So that's what I did. I started to come down here baiting up. Like I say, very simple. All you need is a bucket and a car, drive to the lake, bike to the lake, you don't actually need a car, you know, but I drive down here in my car with my bucket of bait, I do a lap with my Polaroids on, I check all the areas and I put a bit of bait on them. Not loads, you know, you don't need to fill it in. I've done that in the past, put loads of bait in there. Actually, you don't need to. You're far better off little and often. That's the best way to do it. And that's what I did on here. So a couple of weeks before the baby was due to be born, I started to do a bit of fishing. And one swim in particular was a real favourite of mine. I used to see fish in there quite a lot. Wasn't fished very much. And these days, it's fished a lot. But back then, it was quite left alone, and there was a canopy of trees I used to see fish under there with regularity, you know, and that was one of the areas I was baiting. So having baited the spots for a few weeks, it's really hot, you know, it's July, so I can come down in the afternoon and I would regularly see fish sat on those areas. So I started to bait that area regularly, and then came the time to fish. So I dropped in for the night, and in the morning time, one thing I found in that swim is, in the morning, they tend to turn back up. In the evening, they do leave, but they come back into those areas. And that's often the case with a lot of snags. You know, the fish will be in there in the day, they'll move out of a night time, and they come back in the morning. And on my first night in the swim, having done the period of baiting, in the morning I woke up, you know, early doors, first light, nothing had happened. And then late morning, I had a bite. Immediately, as soon as I picked the rod up, the fish had snagged me on the trees. I'm fishing up to the trees, but in quite shallow water. And as he kited along the margin, it took me into the trees, it snagged me up. And there's one thing that is a major problem in this lake, that's the zebra mussels. And where the snags hang into the water, you get small zebras, baby zebras I guess they are, clinging to the roots. So what you end up with is a root ball full of zebra mussels, and a lot of the time that can cut you off. Thankfully this time it didn't, and I heaved and I hoed, I pulled as hard as I could really at one point, and the fish came free. Luckily that little root cluster, it broke off, and I managed to land a really, really nice common. Really nice common. It wasn't a fish that I recognised, and when it went in the net, I'm thinking, what is that carp? Never seen it before, but really, really long carp. Cool fish, you know, and I was absolutely buzzing with that. You know, after the baiting I'd done, that was the perfect repayment for the effort that I'd put in, let's call it that. It did have a little bit of damage on it, and because of that, we treated it up, and then we let the fish go. On that morning, the wind had turned. The day before, when I'd gone down to bait, it wasn't blowing the way it was when I actually came down to fish. And that morning I noticed the wind was blowing up the other end. And there's an area down the other end, doesn't get fished very often, but when the wind blows down there, one thing I've noticed is it's a good place to be. And I could tell when walking around the lake, you know, when that wind did blow there, often I would see more fish than if it wasn't blowing down there. So because of that, I fished the morning and I went home, but I came back the next day. I dropped back into the swim that I'd caught from. Now, the reason I did that was because despite the wind blowing up the other end, there were still fish there, and I'd seen fish there that day when I'd left. You know, and I thought, well, I'll at least do the morning there. I'll start my session there. I had a bite there the morning before, so, you know, I'll drop back in there and see how we get on. Dropped in there for the morning period, nothing happened, the fish didn't turn up, and I kind of kicked myself really for doing that. Noticing the wind blowing down the other end, you know, I'm sat there off the back of it, looking down the lake, and I thought, I need to go up there. I was actually with Dave Robinson at the time. He was down, we were filming a few bits and pieces. I think we were filming some reviews, and we got that out of the way, packed the stuff up. Dave went home and I moved down to the other end of the lake. But before Dave went, he came round to the snags with me, and I stood in the snags, the wind was blowing down there, and as soon as I went in there, you could tell that the water was ever so slightly murked up. Maybe they'd eaten the bait I'd put in the night before. In fact, I'm pretty certain they had done. And fish were ghosting into the edge, and I'm stood there in the trees, I'm looking into the margin. It's quite deep in places, but there are some shallower bits as well, and there was one particular spot in the back of the snags. As there often is, there's always one bit in the back of the trees that's more polished than everywhere else, and on this spot I could see fish creeping in. Now sometimes in there, they see you and they go. On this occasion, they clearly felt a little bit more comfortable to hang around, and whilst I stood there, I actually got quite a good look at several different fish. One in particular, I'm pretty sure it's a fish called the long common. It's a rare carp, it's a very old carp, and it's a very unique carp, massive tail, and it was a fish I'd caught the autumn before. So I'm watching him in there, but there was other fish as well, and I'm thinking, yeah, this is me for the night. So got all the kit into the swim, and as I sat there that sort of afternoon, evening time, the fish were showing like mad, like one after another, on the end of the wind, they were boshing. I'd got my rods out, sweet as a pea, both down the margin along the trees, and I'm thinking, one of these is going to go. You know, any minute it's going to go, surely. But I sat there all evening, the fish kept showing. I don't know how many I saw in the end, but it was a lot of carp. It was a lot of fish showing there. And as it got dark, I'm thinking, how have I not had a bite? You know, the wind was still blowing down there. It still looked and felt perfect. Warm wind in the summer, obviously, but nothing happened. Now, in the morning I've woken up, still nothing. By now I'm just like, what on earth is going on? I knew the rigs were sweet, I had no doubt about that. And my guess is that actually the fish were mostly either in the trees, up the shelf, where I couldn't really get to them. Where you're fishing, it's quite deep, you know, you have to fish down the shelf. I think the fish were up the shelf in the shallow water, where they felt safe, or out in the lake slightly, just off the trees, again, up in the water. You know, I wasn't getting liners and stuff like that. I didn't really expect to, but I didn't get any liners. And when that happens and you know there's carp there, quite often that means they're up in the water. So we got to the morning period, and I'm thinking, I can't blank, surely, and panic started to set in a little bit. There's nothing worse than being on fish and not catching one, especially when it's at close quarters like that. I mean, these fish are showing anything with rod length in front of me to sort of 3 or 4 rod lengths down my margin. And I think I might have had 1 rod out, actually. I think, actually, I had 1 rod in position, not 2. I think a minute ago I said 2 rods. Thinking back, I think it was just the 1. Either way, it doesn't really matter. Fish were showing all over me and hadn't had a bite. Now, got to about 10 o'clock in the morning, something like that, and I thought, I need to have a little look what's going on here. And I sort of walked down the bank ever so slightly, not very far, and sort of just to look into the trees, just to see if I could see any fish moving up and down. Nothing. I thought, right, okay. I've walked back round to my swim. As I stood in the swim, 2 seconds later, the rod's pulled round, hooked into a fish. Didn't really do a lot. I remember him not really doing much. Like, the fight was pretty nondescript, really. You'd think they would go straight for the trees. It didn't. It actually swam out, and rather it come away from the trees out into open water. Like I say, didn't do a great deal, and I netted a lovely mirror. There's some real nice linears in here, and this carp was most certainly one of them. I didn't actually recognise the carp once again, you know. For the second time in a couple of days, I'd caught a fish that I didn't actually know was in here. This one was £29, and something I forgot to mention, the common I had the day before was scraper 30, £30.8, something like that. So I'd had 2 good fish in consecutive mornings, £30 common, and then this one, a lovely £29 linear. Probably be my last carp before I have a baby. And not a bad one. We did the pictures and whatnot, we let the fish go, and I did put my rod back out and hang it out for another few hours, and you've got to do that, and I did. But before long, I did have to go home, and I left feeling like I should have caught more, but at the same time, you know, I was buzzing with the fish that I'd caught. As I mentioned previously, my plan was to start coming to the lake as much as I possibly could in advance of the baby being born, and we were getting close to that time now. So I came back down for another overnighter. I fished another swim, different one to the previous 2 trips. Real small, tiny little gap, another spot that I've been baiting. Did the night in there, woke up in the morning, hadn't had anything, but down the margin there were stacks of bream, like stacks of them. And there's one thing about this lake, that the bream are a serious problem. You know, they are an absolute nightmare. And I was sitting there pretty panicked by that shoulder bream, but there were a few big carp around as well, in the snags, sort of 30 or 40 yards down the margin, and you know, they creep up and down there all the time. So we fished there, I'm thinking, well, I'm still in for a chance here, for sure. You know, I've got an opportunity, because there's fish there, it doesn't take long for them to end up here. I hung the morning out, nothing happened, and you know, I went home. Before I went home, I baited all my spots, and the plan was basically every time I come back to the lake, is to have had all my spots baited and just pick the area that seemed the most likely at the time. So I had loads of different options all the way around the lake, and this time I came back, I dropped into another new swim, like round the back of the island, very underfished area, no one really bothers going in there. Dropped into there, fishing down the left-hand margin to where there used to be a snag. It's been cut out now. We'll talk about that later on. But the snag's been cut out now, but there was a lovely little bush down there. I've shipped the rod down there, and that night I caught a fish called 3 scales, but it was my first bite from this lake the year before, in the summer sort of time. In fact, it was very similar time to this capture, but this was in the middle of the night.